Thank you for attending today's researcher talk. We're extremely pleased to welcome back to the National Archives Dan Carpenter, a longtime friend and supporter of the Center for Legislative Archives. Introducing Dan is one of those where do you even start challenges. I will take the high altitude skim the surface option. He is the Ali S. Freed Professor of Government and Director of the Center for American Political Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. He is a scholar of international renown. He was a visiting professor in 2011 and 2013 at the Université de Strasbourg, l'Institut d'études politiques, and a visiting professor this spring at l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He has written The Forging of Bureaucratic Autonomy, Networks, Reputations, and Policy Innovation in Executive Agencies, 1862 to 1928, which won book awards in 2001 from the American Political Science Association and the International Political Science Association. Reputation and Power, Organizational Image and Pharmaceutical Regulation at the FDA, which won a book award in 2011 from the Social Science History Association. Preventing Regulatory Capture, Special Interest Influence in Regulation and How to Limit It, edited with David Moss and published in 2013. He currently is working on a book manuscript, Visions of the Republic, Petitions, Associations, and Elections in Early America. Dan is the recipient of fellowships and other awards too numerous to mention. Today, we'll hear him talk about Petitions and the Petitions in American Government project, which in its early stages included teams of Harvard researchers who came to the center to compile a massive database of anti-slavery petition, and also included a couple of years ago, a survey of petitions by Lizzie Thompson, who compiled a database of Native American petitions about and from Native Americans sent to Congress prior to the Indian Removal Act. So this is an event we've long anticipated, and we're looking forward to an update on the significant petition project that Daniel's committed to.
Thanks, Richard. After an introduction like that, everything from here on out is going to be a letdown. So I'll just start with the stuff that's most enjoyable, which is petitioning. I'm really pleased to be here, and just thanks for having me down. I just want to sort of give you a couple of introductions. Most of you are undoubtedly familiar with petitions and familiar with these archives, at least as much as I am. But just to fix some terms for discussion, what I'm going to call the prayer of a petition, or its request, is that body of text that presents a grievance or a request of some sort to which people sign their names. When people do sign their names, they do so in what we call the signatory list. That's the list of signatures in a field. Obviously, many of these petitions have signatory lists that go on for many, many pages. You're probably familiar with some of the giant rolled petitions. So these can go on, for miles. If you think about the Chartist petitions of Britain in the 1830s, that would be another example of that. Often the case is that the first upper leftmost name was often the canvasser. Not always, but very often. Or the canvasser is listed in a rolled, if it's rolled or on the back of the petition, the canvasser is listed there. Sometimes this is just a local notable, somebody whose name you would want as sort of a signal to attract other names. Sometimes it's just the first person who signed the petition. But very often this ends up being the canvasser in our research. This is a petition from the women of Marshfield, Massachusetts to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, sent in 1837. And it's all women, which is to say it was canvassed by a woman and probably the prayer was conceived by a woman, and all the signatories are women. This is a petition asking for the same thing from Holland Patent, New York, where you have gender-separated columns, males on the left, females on the right, until you run out of female room here, and then the men decided to put their names on the right as well. So you see a couple of Davids, David Chaplin or Chapin there, Joseph and others. Okay? But this kind of gender-separated column petition was also very common at the time, particularly when women are beginning to circulate and sign petitions massively for the first time in American history. All right? Now, this is part of a larger petitioning explosion that is happening not just in the United States, but actually it's a cross-Atlantic phenomenon in the 1820s and 1830s. And I say it's a matter of degree. There were other petitioning explosions. We can talk about 17th century England during the Civil War. We can talk about the Revolutionary period. We can talk about various moments, Frondist moments in French history and others like that. So it's not the first, but in terms of numbers, and if you start to look at sort of aggregate numbers of petitions sent to state legislatures, national legislatures, and so forth, we see a huge increase in petitioning in the 1820s and 1830s, connected, but not necessarily solely caused by democratization. So one example would be, and this is something that the center has looked into here, is petitions on removal of the deposits from the Bank of the United States during the bank war between Nicholas Biddle and Andrew Jackson, actually Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson. We've actually collected a data set on that, which I'll show you from in a minute. The anti-slavery petitioning campaign of the 1830s, which more than any previous campaign brought the energies of women and African Americans in North American history to the table. That had happened a little bit with Cherokee removal petitions in the late 1820s, but the numbers don't compare in the least to the kind of scale we see with anti-slavery petitioning, not just at the national level, but the state level. We get Native American petitions. One finds those as early as the late 17th century, sent to the English crown, colonial legislatures, and the French crown. But here we begin to get nationalist Indian organizing in the 1820s and 1830s, not just associated with Cherokee removal, but a range of others. Okay? In Upper Canada, which would be, this would be sort of today's Ontario, if you will. It doesn't exactly correspond. The historian Mary Wilton has noted that, in fact, suffrage expansion, which of course was happening in roughly the same time in the United States, was followed as much or more by petitioning as by voting. Right? So the aggregate number of votes goes up, say, 20%. The aggregate amount of petitioning more than doubles, right, in Canada during this period. In French Canada, there's also a slew of new petitions, the Patriote movement, and very much running up to the Quebec revolts of 1837, 1838, which were then suppressed by the British government or the Canadian colonial government. I could go on and talk about Tejano petitions and California petitions in the 1850s, a little bit later on. These are occurring in multiple languages, including transcribed native languages. So you'll see Abenaki Native Americans, for the first time, this is not something they had done, taking their language and transliterating it, all right, into sort of, Roman characters, all right, and essentially using that to petition the Canadian government or the Maine legislature in the 1820s and 1830s. And why they're doing that and not doing that a century before is really fascinating. And this large cross-cultural petitioning explosion, which is occurring in England. Actually, England's Chartist movement occurs after a lot of what goes on here. You also can see this in France. You can see it in Ireland, if you've ever heard of the Morpeth roll, things like that. So it's a really fascinating feature. So that's just to tell you that what I'm going to describe was not just going on here in the United States. It was going on really all over the world, but I think it's accentuated here. So I want to talk to you about two databases today. The National Archives Anti-Slavery Database, which we've collected that Richard mentioned, And then a large project we have on the digitization of Massachusetts anti-slavery and anti-segregation petitions, right? So the database that we collected here took a long time. And it took a long time because, as any archivist knows, things are not usually neatly contained and hermetically closed off in one space. They're often all over the place. And these were in RG 233, but they were also in some Library of Congress files. And thanks to diligent work by many people, including people in this room, and certainly these guys, Ken Cato and a whole bunch of other people who we've thanked, we think we have close to, and you never know, but close to the full complement of petitions sent to the House of Representatives between 1833, start of the 23rd Congress, and 1845, end of the 28th. Okay? That would be 8,637 petitions to the House. All but one are anti-slavery. There was one pro-slavery petition in here. Okay? The petitioning was subsidized by the American Anti-Slavery Society, led by William Lloyd Garrison. The national campaign started in 1835 and expanded dramatically in 1837 for two reasons. Number one, the gag rule, which was passed in 1836, by which the House no longer read on the floor and referred to a committee any petition concerning slavery. That meant that they essentially referred to a process which was known never to convene. It's like referring to a dead committee, all right? That was a huge violation. That wasn't necessarily a violation of the First Amendment. People could still send in their petitions, but it was a huge violation of Anglo-American parliamentary procedure, whereby petitions sent to the lower chamber were given a reading on the floor and put into the hopper, which is to say the committee system, right? That greatly angered many anti-slavery activists and led to a huge increase in the number of petitions. At the same time, and I think at some level independently, Angelina Grimke and Sarah Grimke decide to make an open call for women to begin to petition openly the national and state legislatures and others. I'm not sure which of these two is the stronger influence. It's really difficult to say. I think they both have to be taken into account. But with those two events and a number of other contexts, petitioning really ramps up. They grow dramatically in the 25th Congress. And it's worth pointing out that after this petitioning explosion happens, you see the greatest growth in the number of chapters and in the size of chapters in American anti-slavery societies, not just the AASS, but alternatives, all right? Whether that's cause and effect, we don't know, but I think plausibly it possibly is. That it's a petitioning engendered organization as much as it built upon it, okay? So these are the kinds of petitions we're talking about here. And you'll notice, by the way, one of the things we often deal with in these petitions is that you've got a lot of signatures which are in the identical manuscript, often within surname categories, right? We don't think this in any way represents fraud, at least not an abundance, but it's worth keeping in mind. So here are Cornings, here are Allens and Thayers. This is from New York. Oh no, this is from Massachusetts. Here are Kingmans, although it's not clear that all of these are in the same manuscript. Here's one that is in identical manuscript. And if that doesn't convince you, here is one in which all the signatures are in identical manuscript. But this really points to something important that I want to underscore. These petitions were as much about convincing local audiences among whom the petition was circulated for signatures as they were about convincing the Congress of the United States. Partly the evidence for that fact is that so many thousands of these petitions were sent into a Congress which was known to table them and which was controlled by Southern Democrats, right? But here's another example. This was circulated by one W.O. Duval and probably the Duval family there, okay? But it was accompanied, it was sent to the anti-slavery Congressman William Slade of Vermont. And he says, enclosed is a true copy, the original of which is in my possession, of 80 petitioners praying for slavery. So the original copy was actually not sent into Congress. Now, if you're trying to persuade Congress, why would you send in the one that looks like a fraud, right? And the argument is actually that the way this was often done was that the original one was kept as a copy as almost like a database by the local anti-slavery society, and or was posted on a church or in a town, a public locale to see, to show how many people had signed it. almost as a way of kind of peer pressuring others to sign. Right? This is very common in this period. So this is a heat map of where our petitions come from. So if we tally them up by county, and this is a database of those 8,600 plus petitions, all right? And I should say that this will be released to the public in the matter of a few weeks. The data is forthcoming in an article in the American Political Science Review, and once that embargo is lifted, this data will be available to all of you. Each petition will be represented on a line with exact information on where you can find it here at the National Archives. So each and every petition, right? But the nice thing you can do is you can start to use modern techniques of geographic information systems. And so what we've done here is to conduct a heat map. The hotter the county, all right, the higher the per capita rate of petitioning. What's the right denominator here? We're not using age-adjusted population, things like that. But it shouldn't surprise you that what's called the burnt over district, all right, and this is a county shape file from the 1840 census. What's called the burnt over district is where you're seeing a lot of petitioning. Also in central and eastern Massachusetts. Worcester, obviously a lot's going on there. Also in New Hampshire, parts of Vermont. It's worth noting that in the Western Reserve and Ohio and southern Michigan, there's a fair bit too, although again, keep in mind this is driven as much in some cases by the denominator as it is by the numerator. And you're seeing some anti-slavery petitions coming in from places like North Carolina, all right? A few, not many, but a few, all right? So this will give you a sense of the kinds of things that can be done with these data once you have them rolled up. A couple of things that we noticed, and this is the basis of our paper coming out in the American Political Science Review, petitions circulated by women have more signatures than petitions circulated by men. And you can document this pretty precisely with the statistics. So the total number of petitions just from the 25th Congress is about 5,400. The average petition there has 110 signatures, the median 66. The median differs from the mean because some have 5,000, right? Like Lynn, Massachusetts, New York. Petitions circulated by women only to other women have about 50% greater signatures, 172 versus 110, 92 versus 66 on the comparison for the mean, all right? If it's gender-separated column, which means usually that a woman was active, if not the sole person circulating the petition, you also have a greater number, but again, those numbers are less than women circulating just to other women, all right? If you put this all into a regression model and you compare, if you try to control, well, were women just circulating in places where people were more excited about anti-slavery? Well, what we do is we construct a not too elaborate statistical model that basically controls for every place, each one of the 1,873 cities and counties from which it came, excuse me, and basically the comparisons are now conducted over time within those towns. So it's an average of the changes that happen when a petition goes through the same town at the same time, or same 2-year congressional period, one of them circulated by a woman, one of them circulated by a man. What's the number of extra signatures that you get when a woman circulates it? Almost 100, right? And again, keep in mind that average. So this actually represents, the effect even gets bigger, in other words, once you control for the fact that some places had more anti-slavery petitions than others, right? I won't go into that further. But this gives you an idea, basically, of the kinds of things that you can do. You can do statistical analyses, geographic analyses, you can locate these things, a range of other things. So now let me tell you about a second project, and this is a project where we've begun to digitize petitions. And the idea here is that we would love to basically not only have metadata on these petitions, where you can go online and say, I'm going to click on this, and it has 150 signatures and all the descriptive data here. I'd actually like to see the petition itself, right? We haven't done that yet for RG 233, but we'd like to. And anybody who's at all interested in helping us out on that, email me. I'm yours. And it's, this is, I think, the really exciting project for the coming 10 years is to make sure that those documents, which as anybody who's seen them will know are not in the greatest state of repair, are preserved for future generations. This was a movement that really changed the course of American history. Did it cause the Civil War? That's a whole nother debate. Would the Civil War have happened without it? No. I think that's, or at least not when it did. And so what we've done is, well, let's go to Massachusetts. And what we've done is we've taken all anti-slavery petitions and anti-segregation petitions from 1770 through 1865, all right? This counts for currently 2,600 petitions. We've been so efficient with our digitization resources that we're now going back to the colonial period, which is to say before 1770, as early in some cases as the 1630s, 1634, 1635, all right? And what I'm going to show you is some images from those collections. Keep in mind, again, this idea of local pressure. People circulating and signing these petitions felt that they were answerable not so much to Congress, but to two audiences chiefly. One, people in their neighborhoods who were constantly telling them, have you signed this petition? Have you shown it? Things like that. Similarly, with the Finneyist revival or Finneyite revival in Christianity that occurs in the 1820s and 1830s, the concept of testimony, the way you prove that you have been converted to salvation, right, in Christian salvation with this new Protestant movement is the outward manifestation of inward conversion. And that happens by signing certain kinds of documents like anti-slavery petitions, temperance petitions, and other things. That is the way Finneyism works, and it really revolutionized, American Christianity. So this is the kind of thing that you would see in a number of towns at this time, big cities and small. So the background is, first we have to thank the National Endowment for Humanities, which generously funded this project. They funded us for, I think, 2 years, 2.5 years, 3 years. And what they really did was fund the work of a brilliant and energetic young archivist named Nicole Toppich, who has gone piece by piece through very scattered collections in the Massachusetts archives and has located these. In the process, she's located some of the very first petitions signed by women, Native Americans, and African Americans in all of North American history. The number of news releases that are going to be coming out of this project over the next year and a half as we roll out, all right, here we found the first, petition signed by an ex-slave or an African American freedman, first petitions signed by women, first petitions signed by Native Americans. It's just going to keep coming out because so many of these had not been opened since they were originally deposited in the archives and or sent into the colonial legislature, right? But thanks to the NEH for that. We started in January 2013, and the idea was to identify, then catalog, digitize, and then rehouse for conservation purposes these thousands of petitions at the Massachusetts Archives of the Commonwealth. All right. To date, we've got over 2,600 petitions digitized. We're digitizing the entire signatory list. So for each petition, we may be taking up to 20 or 30 images if it's a long petition. Right? Right now, again, we've got over 22,000 images. These are all online. So if you don't have a handout yet, let me pass these around to you, which both serves as a set of links that you can look at and as a nod to where we're going next, which is to look at women's rights petitions with the run-up to the 19th Amendment, given that Massachusetts was absolutely central to the development of the women's rights movement. We're going to launch a website this fall. Let me tell you right now that every one of these petitions is online and you can access it. The problem, of course, is you would have to literally type in. So what we're trying to do is create a website where you can say, I want to look at all petitions sent to the Massachusetts legislature by Mariah Weston Chapman. All right? Right now, you'd have to literally click through these, but we just beta tested our website the other day, and within a month or two, we're hoping to have a public release where you can just type in Mariah Weston Chapman, 35 petitions appear where she has canvassed or signed her name, all right? You then type from a subset William Lloyd Garrison, find where they both appeared, or find where they both happen to, and it will all, those 35 petitions will come up. You can also download the metadata. So the database that I showed you earlier on which that map was based, that was the National Archives one. We've got a similar one for Massachusetts with township level identifiers, so that can also be geocoded, right? When you go to this website, again, which we hope to launch this fall, you'll also be able to download the metadata. All this will be free to the public, every aspect of it, okay? So just to give you a sense of the petitions, again, this won't surprise any of you who've worked here about the state of affairs of these petitions. This is probably twine from the 19th century, and this is the state in which they've been found. Here is a long-rolled petition, which accounts for one of these petitions that takes up, 20 or 30 digitized images or more, all right? It goes without saying this is not an optimal preservation scheme. I'll just defer to you because you know that better than I do. And so the idea is that not only are we digitizing these so that the physical use declines, but also after they're digitized, they can be identified for saying, well, this one looks, like it's in need of particular conservation work, and you can identify the appropriate personnel at the Massachusetts Archives of the Commonwealth, and they can do the work here. So the nice thing is you're automatically going through a population of petitions and you're identifying documents that need the work because you're actually taking a look at it. It's an excuse, if you will, to do that, although we shouldn't really need an excuse. So I want to underscore some of the connections here, which have been written about by historians for decades, but I think that history is going to end up being not overturned anyway, but even slightly rewritten as the deep linkages between anti-slavery activism and women's rights activism begin to be uncovered in the microhistory of these petitions. I'll give you an example of that. Anti-slavery or historians of abolitionism commonly remark that, and with some justification, that anti-slavery is not the same as abolitionism, that the Garrisonian movement of immediatist abolition, which is to say immediate, uncompensated liberation of slaves, right, from Southern slaveholders, abolition of property rights and slaves in the South, and full political and civil rights for freedmen. Freed women wouldn't have been given the same rights at this time. That is commonly argued to have been quite different from the more conservative anti-slavery positions, like, say, Lincoln, which favored colonization, and which were as much anti-South as anti-slavery. All right? I'm waxing over a huge literature here. It's absolutely true that we shouldn't confuse Garrison with colonizers, right? But it's also true, and we're learning from these petitions for the very first time, that they were often signing the same petitions. People who were known conservatives were often signing petitions and circulating petitions with known radicals, right? And so the previous literature may have sort of cleaved the line too distinctly between sort of moderates and radicals in anti-slavery. And John Stauffer now, who's a scholar of abolition at Harvard, is embarking on a project with some students to really rewrite that part of abolitionism using everything we've got online because Massachusetts is so central, all right? That's not to say, again, it was one big happy family, huge schisms, right? But if we forget to understand that collaboration, we really miss a big part of what's going on. The other thing is that women begin to suggest in these anti-slavery and anti-segregation petitions, petitions which are aimed at the liberation and equality of African American, males and females, right, human beings. Women are beginning to send subtle messages that, wait a minute, maybe there should be another arena of liberation and equality, which is to say on the basis of sex, right? And so what you'll see is a number of women signing under, and I don't have the, I'll have to show you another time, women who would sign them, you'd have those two columns, right, men and women. Sometimes they'd be voters and non-voters. Well, women in Massachusetts begin to convert that to voters and should-be voters, right? And this is a list of should-be voters from a Massachusetts anti-slavery petition. Here again, you see the mass of petitions that we're dealing with. This is again from 1839. 3 years after the gag rule, we're seeing a similar, by the way, upswing in anti-slavery petitioning in Massachusetts. So it didn't just affect petitions sent to Congress. That had a spillover effect, if you will, on petitions sent to state legislatures. Right? It also allows us to look at the history of black petitioning. All right? Usually in Massachusetts, this has been focused on the early work of Prince Hall, who sent petitions for the abolition of slavery in the late 1770s, during that first, if you will, American petitioning wave in the period around the Revolution. The Massachusetts Constitution abolishes slavery in 1780 for reasons that are not directly traceable to this, but have something to do with these kinds of petitions and the claims they made. Famous Quock Walker case and others. But African Americans were in fact petitioning the Massachusetts state legislature early on. But usually these were what we would call epistolary petitions. They take the form of letters with maybe 1 or 2 signatures. What you start to get in the 1820s and 1830s are ones where you actually get a whole range of signatures, and people often incorporating themselves as, black colored citizens of a town and or a labor or guild identity. So this is, of course, also when we're dealing with the 1820s and 1830s, the Jacksonian period, and people are sort of beginning to identify themselves with their labor as well. You'll also get, again, still some African American petitions. Here's one of one Toby Gilmore. This one is from 1750, I believe, by a black woman named Cuba. This is one of the ones that we're going to be rolling out in the next few years as one of the first African American female petitions to have been sent to a North American legislature. Here's one of Thomas Sims. I could go on and on. Sidney Francis. And let me just stop there and say one of the things we start to see in Massachusetts at this time is basically the emergence of much broader black collective identity. All right? But again, it's not, at some level it is, okay, we the African American, we the color, we the Negro, using the terms that they used at the time, citizens of Massachusetts, Boston, things like that. But often sort of incorporated identities such as we are the, the mariners of this town. And so they're often organizing in smaller groups. But that is far different from the early, very individualist, again, epistolary kinds of petitions that we saw in the 1770s. And what that shows, at some level, is the emergence of organization, the emergence of political organizations that were both implicit and explicit that could give rise to petitions like this. All right? We also see women participating, back to women, at a very young age. So here is Lydia Carpenter and Lucia Carpenter, no relation. And she is 11, she is 13. We also have one of the petitions we have uncovered in our work on the National Archives is by Charlotte Woodward in New York. And she was, I believe, also 11 or 12 in Western New York when she signed one of these anti-slavery petitions. She ends up being one of the signatories to the Seneca Falls Declaration in 1848. So we're seeing women, I use women because they could get married at this time, adolescent females, signing at very, very young ages, right? And this is also basically not unprecedented in terms of a tendency for most of American history during this time. You'll see occasional signatures by, kids this age, but not, number one, at the top of a petition where it's pretty clear that they were probably circulating it, right? Often with the time and energy and sometimes even monetary subsidies of their mothers and or parents, and not in such large numbers, right? Here are females all under 16 years old. So here's a group of 15-year-old women, and here's a group of 14, and it would go on down to 13 and 12 and so forth. They would identify themselves as by their age here. Here's a column of women who would be sometimes listed as other persons. What do we have here? Females 21 years and under. Here's men, legal voters. Women over 21 years. Women 21 years and under. So they would often, even in the women's column, classify themselves again by age. Right? So not only are people signing this at such young ages, they're advertising the fact that they're signing at such young ages, right? Which I think is very, very interesting. So let me just say, if you want further information on the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Digitization Project, you can contact me, or you can also contact Nicole at ntopich@fas.harvard.edu. And there have been a couple of articles already, and I think once we have our public launch site, I'm hoping for more media coverage to care less about it for us, but I'd really like the public to use this. I have a feeling people are going to have fun with it. So what's next? I should say I've got lots of other images I can show you, but let me just say where we're moving next is toward the movement for women's suffrage. So the role of petitioning in the anti-slavery movement is, again, well known among historians, although until now we haven't had this kind of exhaustive documentation of all that's come in. And I'm hoping that what we've done for Massachusetts can be done for Pennsylvania, can be done for Vermont. It can't, alas, be done for New York. If you know the history of archives, they had a really bad fire in 1913, I believe, that destroyed a lot of state. Very, very sad. But it should be done and can be done for other state legislatures, and it should be done here. We've identified already between 2,500 and 2,800 petitions on women's rights and women's liberties from 1634 all the way up until 1925. We're stopping in 1925 because that's when things seem to trail off, not just because of the 19th Amendment. It turns out a lot of these are also about women's rights for jury service. Can women serve on juries? Things like that. Right? Religious liberty and toleration. Turns out there are a huge number, and not just from the colonial period and before the First Amendment. With the arrival of Protestant minorities, with the arrival of Jews and Catholics from places like Ireland and Eastern Europe and things like that, a lot of states began to enact laws in the 19th century that infringed upon religious liberty, and we begin to see a lot of petitions on that in Massachusetts. Temperance and prohibition, right? Huge subject of petitioning at the state and at the national level. All right? All of these, it goes without saying, deal with rights that were either already or in part because of the petitioning campaigns themselves eventually inscribed into the Constitution of the United States and or state constitutions, which is not inconsiderable either. We want to digitize other states in NARA. And it's just say not that we're necessarily going to do the work. We want to sort of set up a movement where we start digitizing this kind of work. And then I think the other reason that we've digitized the signatory list as well as the prayer is that we think there's a possibility for genealogical work as well as social history meets political history here when people begin to look at who's actually signing these and where and in what order. And what we're going to do there is we're sort of experimenting right now, and I emphasize experiment with signature transcription. This is controversial on a whole bunch of scales. Some people think, well, we shouldn't just turn this over to political science professors who haven't been trained in handwriting analysis, and I understand that. The numbers are so large, I think at some level it's going to have to be done that. So right now we're experimenting with Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we're experimenting with 2 or 3 transcribers per signature to try to see if there's agreement among people who independently come to the same signature. Then we hope we can link it up with genealogical census records and so forth to get a better sense of who was signing these things and who was not. But that's just at the experimental stage right now, and my hope is that maybe in a couple of years we'll have some better data on that. I'll just, if I can have a couple more minutes, I'll show you some of the other things that we're doing here. But that's really what I wanted to present you today, was mainly on anti-slavery women's suffrage and where we're heading next. But here's just some of the things that we can also begin to do once we look at that larger petitioning explosion that I talked about. Petitions were not simply on these issues which you might call, social, religious, civil rights issues, as absolutely critical as they were. They were also on economic issues, and the bank war is one of those, all right? If you look at what came into Congress between December 1833 and June 1834, that real sprint of Henry Clay-led petitioning against the removal of deposits from the bank, all right? It turns out to be equal in terms of the number of signatures and the number of petitions to the most energetic moments of the anti-slavery campaign in the 25th Congress. So what comes in a 6-month period is equal to what comes in a 6-month period in the 25th Congress for anti-slavery 4 or 5 years later, which is to say that you might think of this as an elite issue, but it was anything but. And not just among Jacksonians, but also among Whigs, all right? And so these, again, occur after the veto of the Recharter Bill, and then the question of what's going to happen with the deposits in the National Bank. Here's one of these petitions, which, by the way, we've got from the National Archives staff. What's interesting here, this is a petition, again, for the restoration of the deposits. People are signing, and they're not giving their physical addresses. If you can see here, this is a tailor, this is a printer and glazer, this is a hardware merchant. We have a piano tuner somewhere here, piano maker, right here. And then some people actually give their, this is 100 John Street or Salem Street or something like that. We've transcribed it, all right? So what you get in these cases are people identifying themselves by trade and or by guild, and sometimes by address, which, by the way, for anti-slavery petitions from New York City, you can geocode and find out literally by mapping the sequence of signatures whether it was walked around a neighborhood and in what order, right? Here is a heat map on the total number of petitions on the removal of deposits. I think it's using the same shape file. Maybe this is 1830, not 1840 from beforehand. Notice here that the Burnover District isn't as prominent, right? And neither is Massachusetts. But Philadelphia and Pennsylvania is, not least because that's where the bank is located. And Kentucky and some of the Ohio River Valley, which is to say Henry Clay territory, gets involved as well, all right? If we go by support versus opposition, so here the red means Whig, and yellow means Jacksonian, all right? We get, again, a sense of strong support for restoration of the deposits, which is We Love the Bank, in Pennsylvania. A little bit less in some of these, for lack of a better word, what I'll call hinterland areas. And then again, Henry Clay territory, lots of, love for the bank, all right? And lots of enmity toward Andrew Jackson, right? So again, what you can do with these things is, I think, rather remarkable. What we'd love to do is to say, once we have the database up there, right, convert this into an interface. So you say, well, wait a minute, I know that my ancestors from about 6 generations back lived in this county. What if we could set up an interface where I can click on that county and I get a drop-down menu of all of the petitions that come from there, and then from that drop-down menu, click on one of those petitions, and I've got not only an image, but a transcribed prayer and signatory list in text. This is possible, right? It's going to take some work, but it is possible, right? We can do the map. Now we have to convert the map into an interface, right? Native American petitions, I just want to show you a couple of these. As he said, I've been spending a little too much time in France lately. This is a petition from the Iroquois to the French governor in 1717. And what we're starting to see, and this is, sorry, The National Archives of the United States does not have this. This is from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And what they would do is basically address the French colonial governor as our father, or my father, mon père. And for each request in the petition, they would pass along a belt of wampum. If you know anything about sort of Iroquois diplomacy during this period, wampum, which is basically made from, tightly ground shells, Kehoe clam shells, beads. And see this first parole and collier, which means a collar or belt of porcelaine, which is wampum, porcelain, which is their kind of equivalent for that term. I could go further on this, but this one also has a little bit of extra decoration to it. Here's another one from the enemies of the Iroquois at that time, which were Algonquin-speaking nations, which had been transported to the French crown by a Jesuit, by a missionary. All right, so you see these as well. Here's one from the Wabanaki nation to Massachusetts. Remember, Massachusetts before 1820 includes big parts of Maine, okay? And these are, they're asking for certain land rights, and this is, I believe, 1777. And what you see here is people signing with their clan name or basically animalistic identities. One also sees this on Iroquois petitions to the British crown and the French crown in the early 18th century. Right? So if up here, people will sign with their sort of transcribed mark, but then they will also sort of give, like a crescent shape, possibly an insect. This might be, some sort of fish, some sort of crane or bird, things like that. Those begin to disappear, but then actually, ironically, so around 1800, you see a lot less of this, but in that nationalist petitioning explosion that I mentioned earlier, where Native Americans are petitioning increasingly state, Canadian, US legislatures, it comes back. So it's not a linear decline. It kind of goes forth. Let me see here. Here are some of these cases where the anti-slavery petition has, in say New York City, an address associated with each signature. So here's one of the things you can do. You can get a contemporary map of, say, 1830s New York, and you can geocode the signatures and where they occur. What we concluded, by the way, from this map is that these petitions in particular were probably not walked around the borough of Manhattan. They were probably laid out at a public place, because if they were walked around the borough, it was incredibly inefficient. The signatures, kind of went, all over the place, one to one. But in some cases, you can see where it probably was. So here's Clarkson Street, Richard Moore at 36, then Daniel Robinson at 38, Clarkson Street, somebody Smith at 40, then 44 Clarkson Street. So you can see miniature sequences where perhaps pages of, or certain pages were walked down a street. And you can literally study the micro composition of a signatory list by a set of canvassers. I'm assuming I'm probably running out of time. So let me stop there, and I'll sort of just leave us what next, and if people want to ask questions. I hope this is convincing you at least that there are immense treasures at the archives, and that with collective effort and cooperation between humanities agencies like the NEH, archives, university researchers, researchers of whatever stripe, scholars, genealogists, that a lot of wonderful public resources can be created. And that the next thing to do is, I think, to start digitizing what's here at the National Archives. That's it.
Questions? Do you want to go back to the map that you had, the initial one for slavery petitions?
Yep.
Because I thought I saw a 0, and being a professional Illinoisan. So you have all those counties. So Are you saying that other than those few, relatively few counties, that doesn't look, that there were basically no anti-slavery petitions?
Now remember, this is 1833 to 1845, so there's a huge wave of them in the 1850s after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott, and a whole range of other things. Those, it turns out, as people here can tell you, are not as well preserved. Those, it would appear, a lot of those have been lost. I'm sure the archives has a lot of them, but both from historians and from people talking here over the years, between the 23rd and 28th Congresses is a much better sample of petitions in the sense of what the representativeness of what the archives has compared to what came in. People have a lot more confidence in. We should study those other petitions as well, but the stories you've heard undoubtedly are of people 100 years ago, can I say this? Yeah, having used some of these petitions for warming fuel during cold winters. Not in the Center for Legislative Archives, no. And so, and whatever other preservation things. And these are some of the huge world. So my guess would be once we get into the 1840s and 1850s, late 1840s and 1850s, you're probably seeing a lot more from that area, but just not 1833 to 1845.
This has been very interesting. What can you tell us about the first petition, 1770, anti-slavery in Massachusetts? Anything in particular?
Well, again, we think that depends on what you call an anti-slavery petition, right? Like abolish the entire institution, things like that. So most people, again, date this to Prince Hall, 1777, 1778, first African-American anti-slavery petition. But now we're starting to find ones that question the legal right of a slaveholder to basically own an individual slave in Massachusetts earlier than 1770. So what might come out of these digitization exercises is a better awareness of when that first anti-slavery petition appeared. And I don't know. Is the bottom line. I mean, the story of Prince Hall has been told before. I would look up work by Daniel Mandel and others, people writing in the New England Quarterly, and I think there was an article in the William and Mary Quarterly. And there's kind of an elite network of freedmen based in Nantucket, a little bit in Boston, Martha's Vineyard. Prince Hall is one, and there's this kind of elite network that kind of, I mean, elite for the time, and by, you know, relative to other populations of African Americans in Massachusetts that begin to sort of light this fire. Okay.
Well, I have many questions, but only two brief ones right now. One is, can you tell us about the one pro-slavery petition that you located? And two is, when you were talking about search capabilities with your Massachusetts state set, you talked about name searches. So you're saying that you've entered some names into the metadata, and which
First
names
10,
did you?
yeah, I'll start the second one. The
Okay.
first 10 signatures, I believe, on every petition have been entered in. And what that does, and that was by Nicole, who again has just been, you know, she is really the author of this project. She did that, and you know what that's doing is oversampling, if you will, if I can use kind of the language of statistics, oversampling elite and or prominent signers. So you're going to pick up people like Mariah Weston Chapman, and you're going to pick up people like Garrison and Wendell Phillips. So those done. Until we, you know, get this crowdsourcing thing running, we're not going to get things. But yes, we do have some signatory data already. I don't know about that petition, and I will look it up. And it may be, you know, to be honest, I picked that from one I gave several years ago, and there may be more than that. I know we have one. And this may have been from an early 25th Congress sample, and it's possible in some of the other Congresses there might be more than that. But, you know, 99.9% of these are anti-slavery And what I don't know, though, is whether we start to see, more pro-slavery petitions once Southern slaveholders begin to mobilize a bit more in the late 1840s and 1850s. And I just don't know.
Well, there was that one famous one, do you remember, that John Quincy Adams used to attack the gag rule, and he wanted to submit a petition that Southerners denounced him, but he said it was one that was from Fredericksburg for pro-slavery.
Oh, maybe that's
I
it.
looked and I could never find it in our records, so
Well, I will look it up. Yeah.
I lived in North Carolina for many years. I'm just curious, the petitions that were in North Carolina, were they Quaker based? Do you know if they were?
I should, again, in 2 or 3 weeks, you'll be able to look it up. But I don't know.
I find that interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes me feel better for North Carolina, to say the least.
Well, I mean, yeah, and of course, this is the period in which there is no West Virginia, right? So, I mean, there was a lot of anti-slavery sentiment in the border states, right? So, I mean, that's not just the border, but the kind of trans-Appalachian areas of the South. I mean, it's mixed. You also have slaves and slaveholders in these areas, but it's very, so I'm just repeating what, historians of slavery could tell you much better than I could, but yeah.
For the 8,600, how many were repeat offenders for canvassers? So would a canvasser be active and do 100 petitions in that 8-year span?
That's a great question. We have not done that, although I think our database will allow for that analysis. I leave you to write that paper. Now, and I'm not trying to just pass the buck, but that's exactly the kind of thing that you'll be able to do with this data, is to say, all right, let's stack it and just sort by canvasser, name of canvasser. And once we've done that, how many were by? I mean, clearly some people emerged, so Mariah Weston Chapman, certain women. Women are very prominent, not just in terms of the number of signatures, but in terms of repeat offenders. Your term, not mine.
And then for cataloging and the geomapping, to what level is it? Is it township? Is it region? Is it what level of detail is going to be on the website for interaction?
So it depends which one you're talking about. So for Massachusetts, we have township. Because county, I mean, Massachusetts just doesn't have a lot of counties, so that's and you could do this. I believe it's township if we can get that. Now, sometimes people will say we, the citizens of Oneida County, do that, and they will identify themselves from a county, and then all we can do is really, unless we lack, we just somehow have better, location information on the signatories. All we can do is code it as Oneida County. What we do have for this is. Of these 8,673 petitions, we have 1,873 different geographic identifiers. And given that they're all coming from a couple hundred counties here, that leads me to believe that we've got, I mean, I know we do, we've got a lot of township identifiers. We always identified township if we could. And so that will be there, and you should be able to identify that. And so, yeah, in theory, with an alternative map, if you've got the right shapefile in GIS, you could do this at a much more micro level, right? Yeah.
What would be the incentive for the young ladies who wrote their age on the petitions? Why would they include how young they are?
I'm thinking, the incentive word is at some level right, but at some level, you might want to think of what's the social logic, I mean, right, things like that. Again, I think the audience here is often their God, right? It's not a logic of precociousness, maybe, but given what I have been reading from the time in terms of social history, these are people who are trying to demonstrate to their God and their community of fellow believers that they are in fact saved. Again, the idea is, what's the outward manifestation of the inward conversion? That's the, yeah. Other questions?
believe our time is about expired, and we thank you so much, Daniel, for this fantastic presentation. Thank all of you for attending and participating, and I think we have a lot to look forward to with the upcoming article and the website coming up, so we'll be on the lookout. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's it.